Howdy folks, welcome to another episode of the Scannell Agenda. This is show number 17 and today's date is May 16th. I'd like to talk about the herring runs. When I was a boy growing up in Harwich, I grew up at 706 Main Street, which has changed the number, but it's across from Brack's Landing. And I was sad to hear that they pulled out the stone bridge that was over the herring run there. So I was always the first to know when the herring were coming in. As a boy, it was always a big, exciting thing for me. And then as, say, my brother David, when he went to college, the herring took a turn for the worse. So I was probably, I don't know, 10 or so. So that would have been, you know, 67, 68, right around there maybe. I'm not sure, but they drastically declined very quickly. And these are all the runs, so it wasn't something we were doing on Cape Cod. Some people blamed it on pesticides and so forth, but I don't think so. I had always thought that it was the offshore herring boats. Okay, now the herring history in Harwich goes way back, and I do believe the first market quota system was in Harwich for fisheries management, but they didn't call it that, of course, because these herring runs were given, each run had wardens, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal because, you know, the herring was a big resource back then for the people. And if you read the history of Harwich, I think it was 1789 that Harwich landed 1,200 barrels, and I'm not sure what the dimension of a barrel was back then. And that's a huge amount of herring, okay? Now, Brewster used to be a part of Harwich back then, and I think it was 1803 or so that the Brewster got spun off into its own town. Now, we have to rebuild this fishery, and a very exciting thing I saw at the herring run in Brewster, Stony Brook, Paynes Creek, was, I think I was looking at some Atlantic salmon. They were about this big, and I'm not sure what they were, but it might have been Atlantic salmon coming in there. I saw 10 or 15 of those fish making their way up. And I guess they nabbed somebody down our brook there, which we were told the name of the brook when I was growing up. I always called it the brook, but I guess it's Cold Brook anyway. So elvers were taken illegally, and they nabbed them. That same brook where I grew up, Cold Brook, I think it is. Back then, the ditches were maintained as a matter of great concern. The waterways were kept open, ditches that went up into the ponds, up through the bogs. And it was the herring industry that was there first before the cranberries. And that was an issue, you know, you didn't want to be planting a bog in and then stopping the herring. So Cold Brook went way up into Grassy Pond and Paddock's Pond, and it's known as Andrews River at Saquatucket Harbor, which branches off. And it's got the East Fork, I think that's called Andrews River, but that goes up into what was known as, when I was a kid, Blackie's Pond. I think it's just, I don't think it's a pond anymore. And then that particular historic waterway, I believe, that brook or ditch or whatever you want to call it, I think that went way up into Buck's Pond, and that's all been cut off now. I know there are landlocked eels in John Joseph Pond, which is right next to Buck's Pond. And things can do okay. They can get trapped and get landlocked. Over on Nantucket, we had some landlocked white perch in Maxey's Pond, where the old town of Sherburne was, the first settlement on Nantucket. And they were the same genetic species, but they were very small fish. And a white perch can run up to, 5 pounds, around there. That would be a big white perch. But the white perch is a close relative to the striped bass. And I remember catching a white perch. I didn't know what it was when I was a little kid, with the nets, going for the herring. But that was an industry for Nantucket, the white perch with the salt ponds. And I did seine. I was invited out to the ponds to seine the ponds, which was an industry on Nantucket. Probably about regularly 5,000 pounds of white perch would be shipped out. And that was considered to be good management, because you'd be taking the big fish and you'd be letting the little fish come up. So these salt ponds on Nantucket could produce quite a bit. Oh, by the way, this is the Yankee magazine, April 1992, and I'll just show you an award-winning picture. If you want to look this up on the internet, you can probably find it. Read this article, April 1992, Yankee magazine. And that's my son Tom in the background. I'm being arrested by the state police again. I mean, this was repeatedly, it's ridiculous, but the ditch that divided Nantucket. That piece of history, as I've gone on at length about, is quite something. Okay, back to the herring. And by the way, those ponds on Nantucket were considered to be herring runs, and the openings of the pond, which I was attempting to do, and I did open Hummock Pond twice, and the herring did get in, back up in there. But these were herring runs, so that the opening of the ponds on the vineyard on Nantucket, where they would be opened, they didn't bother the vineyard. They didn't have the history we did. The vineyard, I guess, decided to go in with the state around 1900 as far as the ownership of the ponds, which goes back to 1693, and then it was fought over in 1717, as I mentioned. But these were all herring runs that needed to be opened twice a year, in the spring and fall, because you let the herring in, and the eels out, or whatever is coming and going. A lot of things are coming and going. It's a clean exchange of water, which makes for a very productive marine environment. Probably the single most productive marine environment that I know of or ever heard of was Sacajah Pond on Nantucket. All right. So the maintenance of herring runs has always been big. I'm surprised it was able to get overridden by kind of nutty people that wanted to turn the ponds into freshwater ponds. They didn't know what they were doing. They had no studies, no environmental impact study. It was very, very reckless. Very reckless. All right. Now, we need to get into aquaculture to bump up the alewives or herring, river herring. And I figured to do that we could start out by using old fiberglass hulls as tankage. If you take a couple of, let's say, small 15 or 16 foot fiberglass runabouts that are basically sitting around, you end for end that and turn that into a 30 foot, 32 foot double ender that you can row. And that would be the tankage we can start out with to do some experimental aquaculture with the spawning of what few river herring we can get a hold of. And I guess they're coming back. And it's about time. Because we really have let that go. So these would be double-duty tanks, boats that you could use and row around. You could even put a PV awning over it, and you could go fishing and go for little boat rides. One thing I learned at the Nantucket Marine Laboratory was that new fiberglass tanks are very toxic to scallops, probably other things too. But we were, the people that knew what they were doing there did not want to recoat and freshen up the polyester resins on some of these plywood tanks that we used, because the plastic is toxic. It leaches out a little bit. So we have a lot of history, especially in Harwich on the Cape. I think Harwich was probably one of the bigger herring runs on the East Coast. So it's important to know the history, because then we have something to shoot for. Then we have a rough baseline as to what we can produce for these river herring as opposed to the sea herring. Years ago, I think it must have been 2004, 2005, I went to a scheduled National Marine Fisheries Service Council meeting where I spoke about the herring fishery, and I spoke against giving away the fisheries rights and then going with this limited entry business, which I find to be inadequate to our needs, to say the least. It's a patronage system. And I believe we need the market quota system for all the fisheries, especially fisheries like the herring fishery. But I do believe that the market quota system got its start in Harwich many, many, many years ago, when they basically auctioned off or leased the herring runs out. But I'm not sure about that. They didn't listen or comment, went in one ear and out the other. National Marine Fisheries Service is basically governed by, you know, your fishermen go into a room with politicians, and the few scientists that get heard are the yes men. It's a very political system, and I do think we need a Congress of marine scientists, like the folks that I worked with at the Nantucket Marine Laboratory, actually doing the fishery management. I don't think fishermen are good at that job. It is an exception to the rule that a fisherman is good at that job, and I am the exception to the rule, because I do believe in public aquaculture, the market quota system, of a very well-defined game plan or philosophy about fisheries. And we're out of codfish, of course, you know, so we're doing something wrong. Your codfish eat herring, and also your whales eat herring. So these are foundational fisheries. Things like mackerel, these are foundational. Bait fish, squid, menhaden. These aren't things you want to drag down to the lowest possible level. And one thing a patronage system does when it gives away fishing rights to a few people is it pretty well guarantees that we will have fisheries management done for the people that own the fishery. And the people that own the fishery and own the permits don't want the fishery expanded, because that would water down, that would possibly expand the fishery and then water down their holdings. So if economics is a science, and I do think it is a basic math type science, it hasn't worked with this giveaway program of patronage that is called limited entry. Now, I have complained that the National Marine Fisheries Service has no listing of the values of the permits, port by port, boat by boat. I need that list so I can argue for the market quota system, but the National Marine Fisheries Service is not doing ecosystem-based management. They're involving themselves, and they have for many years since the mid-70s, in this buffoonery called limited entry, where, oh, there are too many boats chasing too few fish, and then, oh, what do we do? So we shut out the fishermen. We shut out the kid in high school who no longer has any rights to be a fisherman. And to me, the answer is not to gather up and start trust funds for the kids getting out of school. The answer is not that. It is to not to try to fix a patronage system, but to disband the patronage system and replace it with an equal opportunity system, ecosystem-based management, scientifically controlled systems, and we don't have that. We have none of that. It's really a shame. So I've been getting into this, how do we bump up the herring? And here's one of my first primitive drawings of, this is a 50-foot raised bed for the alowife spawn. In other words, you'd have legs and you'd have this raised fabric trampoline type of a setup here, and you might have 400 of these in Long Pond. And what we would do would be to get the mix of the milt and the eggs for the alowives, or the herring I call them. And then you'd be able to do this with amateur aquaculture people such as myself. And you get the recipes, and then you'd load this with the spawn, and this would be controlled for water quality. Here we have a bag over this set table, you might want to call it. It's a raised bed for jump starting the alowives that you do have. So this is the kind of detail work I like to do. And this might be that you would have the herring getting a start for a couple of weeks, and then you would be letting them go. And thus, you'd probably increase the spawn ratios in the wild setting by, probably 25 or 50 times or more. This is pretty well settled science as far as how to get the eggs and the sperm together. Now, we could trade the herring using the market quota system. We could trade labor for the fish. And we could also have quality circle meetings and have a green... I think I have a green thumb for seafood and such. And you need people with kind of a gift for that kind of thing, which I think I've got. I was raised in the garden and on the herring run. And your first rule is Mother Nature needs and wants what Mother Nature always had. So that's, if you start from that point, you're going to do all right. So that is an active project for me right now, getting the herring going. Okay, now I want to switch gears here, and I want to talk about the Pilgrim nuclear plant. I think our Senator Wolf and Dr. Friedman did a good job with the debate that they had on NPR about a week or two ago. And one fact that was put on the table by Senator Wolf was that Cape Cod alone is worth $72 billion in property value. Now we have 12, possibly 12 billion plus 10 billion somehow in insurance money that can cover the losses, which I find to be, these uninsurable projects. To me, you really got to scratch your head and wonder, what the heck are we doing? So sometimes I go on blogs and I just throw something up there, run it up the flagpole. And I kind of thought that every nuclear plant, if we're going to move ahead with nuclear, should be a U.S. Navy-owned plant, nuclear plant, and also a Navy base at the same time. So you might go with 1 or 2 or 3 modern stock reactors. That would be safer. These are the walk-away models that are much safer, so you don't have a meltdown. And maybe we could have 16 nuclear plants on the East Coast. Because, well, there was one reason why my dad was opposed to moving the dump in Harwich inland. Now that dump was right on, it was in a bad location, but what is a good location for a dump that's going to leach out? Well, a bad location would be in the middle of your aquifer. A less bad location, which was where the dump was on the corner of Lothrop and Gilbert Ave in Harwich, and I can remember going there. My grandmother used to love to go there and watch the seagulls. She had a love for seagulls, like I do. Anyway, it's kind of like that concept. You don't want to put something that's possibly going to pollute in a very nasty way right in the middle of your aquifer. And so it is with the nuclear plants too. If we could design these Navy nuclear plants that are also doubling as a military base for obvious reasons. Yeah, I don't get into the security reasons. I would, but not publicly. I have my opinions. But this is a very dangerous situation, and I think if we were going to move ahead with this nuclear, I think we'd want to do so with Navy ownership because of the uninsurable nature, and we can't trust these private enterprise companies to do it for us because they don't have the self-interest to do it for us. One other thing that's kind of related to that and related to the Pilgrim evacuation is this. And I don't know whether I have 2 heads or not with an idea like that, but this is another idea along the same lines of letting the United States Navy own the nuclear plants. And I put it out there. I didn't get too many comments. Interesting idea. It would be a game changer. Now, the Navy SEALs, I'd always thought years ago, and a few people thought I was a little nuts for mentioning this, but I thought the Navy SEALs should be the people to do the whale disentangling. I thought that would be a good crew to do that, and I still think so. So that would be a Navy SEAL whale works, disentangling, the disentanglers for the few whales that do get hung up with the fishing gear. So we might need to go, this is an emergency situation with our global warming, and another interesting fact with the nuclear plants was brought up by Dr. Friedman, and he said there would be about 7,000 tons of coal a day that would be burnt to produce the same amount of power that the Pilgrim nuclear produces. And I was floored by that. I had no idea it was that much. So the Navy SEALs, I thought, would be the best people to disentangle the whales. So wouldn't it be a good idea, running this up the flagpole, I'm not proposing this, but it might be a good idea, to do a Cape Cod Navy base right at Otis Joint Plant. What do they call that thing? I don't know. I always thought that was funny. In this day of the great marijuana controversies, which I should get into, but I'm kind of weak. I have a lot of strong ideas about that, but I just... anyway, The whale disentangling mission would be a minor mission for the Cape Cod Navy SEALs if this happened. And they might even go through some fisheries training as a break from just the strictly military training and sailing and boating training, get them on the water, give them a little R&R, Coast Guard work, rescue work, help the Coast Guard. They could do education in schools, and Cape Cod Community College is right there, and Mass Maritime is right there. This might lend itself. And you know, you might want to have a couple C-130s for the, let's say, 200 Navy SEALs on active duty right here in New England, which could be central. You could use them. They could be quickly deployed, you know, for anywhere from the Virginia to Maine in Canada if something went haywire. They could dive for lobsters and save the Navy some food budget money. Homeland Security might like them being there and in New England. And so the Pilgrim nuclear plant could be protected by Navy SEALs. I don't know if I have two heads or not. Is that crazy? I don't think it's crazy. I think it's just a kind of a new idea. Now, I've got 2 minutes left here. Years ago on Nantucket, I saved cans for a while. I got $70 to start up a kids group called the SEALs, which would be like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts, Future Fishermen of America. It would be fun training, field trips, uniformed service for kids. And I want to get into that, and I've never said I wanted to start a nonprofit except for that one. I would like to do that. You know, and you'd have different chapters: South Coast, South Shore, North Shore, Boston, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, 3 for Maine, 3 for Connecticut. So we'd have the SEALs, and this would be a good, it would be kind of like the Sea Scouts in a way, but we could start it brand new and write all the rules that would be proper for such an organization of kids. And I had it up to age 25 because you'd want your kids in college to be part of that. And if that rings a bell with anybody, that we could use an organization like Cape Cod SEALs, that would be good. Now, on a more controversial nature, I think we need to send some of our SEALs, the real SEALs that are swimming out there, send them up to the north to feed the polar bears. I don't know if that's a crazy idea, but we have plenty of SEALs, and we've got starving polar bears out there. So save the polar bears, feed them our SEALs. I don't know if that's a right-wing or a left-wing idea, but it might make sense. So I'll get into that issue later on. Thanks for watching the Scannell Agenda.